Welcome to all our listeners. My name is Auren Israel and I am the chairman of Auren Israel, the leading international consulting firm in Israel. Auren Israel is part of an international network of offices operating in more than 70 countries and over 300 branches worldwide. As part of our podcast channel, we are excited to share with you the special podcast season which focuses on life science and their business application. We will host here key people who will share with us their point of view about research, academia, application, and business in the fields of science. Hello to our listeners. We are happy that you join us, and we want to welcome Mr. Timothy Henry, which will guide us through the world of conscious capitalism. Following our first chapter, which we get a little bit of understanding regarding this definition and the world of conscious capitalism. I want to join with me Mr. Amir Kahani, my colleague and partner in VSO Consultancy Division at Auren Israel. Hello, Amir.
Hello, and thank you for being with you.
Amir, could you take us from the last point of the first chapter, actually from, let's say, the theoretical world to the practical world together with Timothy?
Yes. Well, the last question that I asked Timothy was, or one before this, was his own purpose. Now, there are different terms about purpose, and I wonder, Timothy, if you can highlight the difference or if it's similar between the word purpose and vision. And actually, the purpose, how strong is the influence of being able to define my purpose in a sense that with this, I will be able to increase my profit?
Well, not to get into too much or too long a debate about the difference between purpose and vision, but at its core, a purpose is why your business exists. What's the fundamental reason why this business exists? A vision is often an imagined future in which that purpose comes to life. So you might say the vision for the business in the next 3 to 5 years is to accomplish the following things. Now, that vision is underpinned by this idea of purpose. This is why our business exists. And if we did this really well, we would have this vision of what we could be in the future and how we accomplish that. So that is the fundamental difference between purpose and vision.
And when you stated the word purpose, is there any differentiation between the business purpose and the brand purpose? Is there any similarity? Are they tied together? How do you gather those two things for the success of the organization?
Well, I think that underlying that is an interesting observation that I've had over the last 12 years. So 12 years ago, when I first started, talking about conscious capitalism, and I'd bring up the word purpose, and I'd be talking about purpose, often people were saying, wow, that's really interesting. What are you talking about? And of course, nowadays, purpose is one of the most overused phrases in business. And in fact, we've gone full circle to the point where I think there's a lot of what I would call purpose washing occurring. Now, when I talk about purpose washing, what I mean by that, and having a brand purpose is important, but some companies think that having a brand purpose is the same thing as having a business purpose, and it's not. So a lot of companies will go out, and in fact, almost all of the advertising agencies these days have some kind of purpose group that is helping companies define brands with purpose. Because the studies have shown that if a brand has a strong purpose, it tends to outperform those brands that are not considered to have a strong brand purpose. But that's not enough. That's really communicating a tagline to your customers. A true purpose and a purpose well lived inside an organization is when purpose begins to permeate throughout the organization. And that is where the real power of purpose becomes very important. So I can give you an example of that between, two of the leading competitors in the pet care business. There's the two leading companies in that area are actually Mars, who's also known for their candies, and Nestle's, which is known for many things. But those are the two largest pet care providers in the world right now. And if you look back about 5-6 years ago, they were both evolving their way of communicating purpose. And it's a great example because while they both claimed to have a purpose, one of the companies actually built that into their strategy and made a significant shift in their business as a result of that. So if you looked back then, they both had a purpose statement that basically said almost the same thing about making the world a better place for pets. And Nestle's was slightly different, one in that it just said, we want to be better for pets or something like that. And it was not a big difference in terms of how it sounded when they spoke them out loud. But what happened as a result of this was that Mars went on a very different journey of trying to sort of say to itself, if we were really making the world a better place for pets, what would we be doing differently beyond just selling better dog food? So they set out to ask themselves that question and to say, what would that look like if we were really fully committed to that purpose? And that meant things like, how do we support veterinary services? How do we ensure that our pets stay healthy? How do we help you monitor the health of your pet? How do we combine all of that into a custom-made nutritional program for your pet? And so as a result of that, they've sort of created a larger ecosystem of support and care for pets that for them goes all the way down to veterinarian services that they've now gotten into, and even experimenting with the equivalent of a Fitbit for your pet, for your animals, so they can walk around and monitor real time the state of their health. And that's very different than where Nestle's went with basically with their Purina brand and actually making a marketing campaign about why their food was better for your pet. And I'm not saying that what Nestle's did was wrong, but I'm trying to explain that when you really took that purpose seriously, as Mars did, you go in a very different business direction and you start to do things in a very different way. And that's what they did. And the result has been that that's their most profitable division within Mars.
So I would like to take you for another stage. Up to now, you have shared with us from your experience for what happened in the world with the focus of giant companies, multinational companies. But I would like to take you for a tiny company, for startup companies in every field, and especially mainly on the life science arena that we have here in Israel. We have plenty of startup companies in the life science arena. And I try to imagine myself that I come across with a CEO or the founder of a small startup company, and I'm talking with him about the purpose and all this stuff. He will look at me and say, "What the hell you are talking with me? I need budget. I need fundraising. Bring me money. Don't spend my time by talking about purpose." What is your advice for this?
Well, one of the things I often say is, listen, conscious capitalism isn't an excuse for not having a good business plan and a good business strategy. So on the one hand, those leaders are absolutely right. You know, the funders are looking to see, do you have a good business plan? Now, the second thing they're going to be looking at is, are you going to execute that extraordinarily well? And that's what I've always found to be the most fascinating aspect of this, that when you think about it at its core, what we're talking about is superb execution of your business plan. So which organization do you think is going to do a superb job of executing? And I want to go back to this question or the issue that I raised earlier about trust and engagement. So even in your startup mode, you want to be very conscious of creating a culture that's a great place to work culture, where people are coming in and are super excited about the work they're doing. They're feeling that the organization is trying to nurture and create an environment where they can be their best. And often, in that startup phase, it's easy to take your eye off the ball on that. It's easy to be not focusing on culture. And that becomes real clear, particularly when you're in a startup mode where every hire starts to matter. And sometimes there's this really tough decision that a CEO has to make between filling a position because we need someone in that position and filling that position with the right person. And at least my experience in startups has been you live to regret making bad hires where the person isn't a good fit. They may have the technical competency, but if they're not a good culture fit for the kind of culture you're trying to develop, you're going to come to regret that over the next 2 or 3 years. So sometimes it's more important to wait for the right person to fit into that culture that you're trying to create. And so those hires matter. But you've also got to be clear, what kind of culture is it that you want to create? What kind of culture is going to be one that you think will help you bring out the best in the people you hire and therefore be able to execute against your business plan with excellence and speed?
You are going down into the culture, and I would like to give you some example that I read lately.
Mm-hmm.
There is a $1 billion Israeli company in the high-tech arena that has copied the same culture as a bigger company, meaning they saw what is the culture in the more advanced company and they adopt it. So we can say, follow those who had succeed. Why do I need to create my own culture if I make a copy paste and maybe to succeed? So how do you handle this?
Well, I begin with maybe even challenging what you just said, which I think it's impossible to copy and paste a culture, because in the end, cultures, you have a culture whether you like it or not. By default, every business has a culture, because at its core, culture is really just about the way we do things around here, right? It's about the values that we live. It's about the symbols we have in the business, about what's important. And it's about the systems that we have that support those things. So in a sense, it's impossible to cut and paste a culture. However, having said that, I think we've clearly got examples of companies where the values that they've chosen, we're starting to see a lot of similarities about those kinds of things, about values that put a premium on relationships, that put a premium on people taking responsibility, put a premium on trying to build trust and doing the right thing. And I think as we start to go down those things, we see that there is a common set of directional values that people are finding underpin great cultures. And having said that, the question then becomes, do you live it? Do you actually bring that to life in a meaningful way inside your business? And the way I do that, or have done it with clients, and I'll give you an example from sort of the life sciences. It was 2 of the leading dental technology companies getting together in a merger. And one of the first things we did as a part of that merger was to sit down with the new executive team and walk through with them what were the values that they thought would bring the best of both of the former companies together. So when they thought about the cultures and the histories that the 2 companies had done, we went through an exercise where we actually did that. Tell us the history of when your past business was at its best. The other company, tell us the history of when you were at your best. And then we sat with the executives and said, how do we bring out the best of both? And what would that look like to be the best of the best from a culture point of view? And so the executives went through a process of defining what they thought those values might be that would bring out the best in the new business. And then we created what I called a culture book. And that culture book then took each one of those values and said, what does this value actually mean? What do these words mean? And then said, what are good examples of this? What are bad examples of this? So like when we don't live this value, what does that look like? And then the last bit of that was, as a leader, what are the most important things you can do as a leader to walk the talk, to model what this value looks like? And so they began with that. And so right from the beginning, they were able to point to a document and say, this is the culture that we want in our new organization. And this is what it's going to mean. And then they began to communicate that and educate people on what that looked like throughout the entire organization.
I would like to ask for the implementation point of view. We are now facing a huge crisis. It's called the Corona crisis, and the economic crisis that follow afterward. And maybe in the next 1, 2, 3 years ahead, we will have another crisis because of different mutation. We don't know what we face with. Now, how can, I don't know if it is possible, but because I've been in many places as a CEO, I try to imagine to myself during this crisis. First, can a middle-sized company, can change its culture and value? And secondly, why we should do it during the crisis? Because we are all the time facing something burning, and we need to solve this emergency problem. So if I can change my culture and my value, it's an ongoing company with a history. And how do I do it in this crisis period?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways of answering that, Amir. And the first one is Warren Buffett made a quote that I've always thought was interesting: never let a good crisis go to waste. And what he meant by that is that a crisis, if nothing else, really focuses one's attention on what's critical and important in a business. And you are so right that I don't think there's, people have been talking about what some people call the VUCA world, this constantly changing world, how the pace of technology change and everything else has never been greater before the crisis. and now we're in a period where, none of us have a good grasp on exactly what the world's going to look like over the next few years. So I would argue that it's never been more important to focus on organizational resiliency and the ability of an organization to adapt quickly to a constantly changing world. Now, those are nice words, but from an implementation point of view, it really means what is the culture and how am I creating an organization where we can adapt quickly, we can change quickly, where I am empowering people closer to the front lines of the organization to make decisions closer to the front, closer to the place where the action's actually happening, so that we can respond more quickly to this rapidly changing environment. So the race over the next 2 to 3 years is going to be to those companies that can adapt and change quickest in a very uncertain business environment. So this goes back to this question of what are the traits of a business that is highly adaptable, can change and respond quickly to a changing environment. And that's where I would go back to the whole question, and we're really seeing it with COVID, is what's the level of trust and engagement in my organization? I think we have seen that some businesses, and one of my clients, which is only about $1 billion in sales size, it's in the retail business, but they're a global business. In 2020, in March of last year, when the COVID crisis hit, at one point they had 85% of their stores closed. Yet by the end of the year, they'd actually improved their revenue by about 5%. So at some points, 85% of their stores were closed. And yet by the end of the year, their revenue was up 5%. And part of that was they created a new channel, which was direct to consumers. And they also went online and switched a lot of their sales online. So they did a couple of things that they responded very quickly to this changing environment, and it showed up on their top line. Now, I use them as an example because they were a very purpose-driven business, and they had spent the last 2 years talking about purpose, driving purpose into the business, talking about creating purposeful entrepreneurs at all levels in the organization. And that actually led to a high engagement, high trust environment that allowed them to change very quickly and rapidly in terms of reacting to a changed environment. And so that's the reason why, even if you're a mid-sized business, that you really want to be asking yourself, am I creating a high trust, high engagement culture during this time? Now, practically, that often means, am I communicating clearly with my people about what's going on? Am I engaging them actively in trying to search for new ways in which we operate? Are we working together to try to save costs rather than, as some businesses have done, which is just sort of say the only way to save costs is lay people off? Well, that has a price that pays when that's when that's the first lever that you pull. Other businesses have said, no, actually, we're going to try to give people a certain level of job security that may mean that we're decreasing salaries across the board, but we're going to engage people in trying to find creative ways to be more efficient and to cut costs out of the business so that we can survive. Those businesses that have done it in a more inclusive, collaborative way and tried to help people feel safe and secure during this crisis have tended to thrive more than those that just went to the traditional, we'll just cut heads as a way of trying to save costs during a crisis.
Timothy, I think that those examples are quite good, but I want to ask you two practical questions. The first one is, obviously you have quite a lot of experience with big companies, small companies, medium companies, and according to your understanding or any statistic that you made, what is the most, let's say, point that you can share with us regarding the trigger or the motivation of companies approaching you and asking you, okay, Timothy, now we need some assistance and we want to go deeply into the conscious capitalism? And the second one is, when should we mention that to our client? In which kind of period of their life should we mention, listen, guys, you need to come for consulting regarding that. You need to come to get some guidance, because this is the right point for you to start handling this kind of let's say, challenge thinking and going into the conscious capitalism.
Yeah, that's a good question around where does the point of entry? Where do you begin to have this dialogue? And I find that it's quite amazing when you reframe the issue in the following terms. If I sort of say to you, listen, in the next 3 to 5 years, if you were leading, if your business became a great business, what would a great business look like to you? Now, inevitably, one of the first parts of that generally deals with financials. We're incredibly profitable, we've doubled our size, etc. But then when you probe a little deeper and you say, okay, well, tell me a little bit else. What else would make it a great company? And what would it be that would help you achieve those lofty financial goals? Almost inevitably, where people start to go with that is they start to talk about the fact that they have raving fans for customers, so that they're going to be creating deeper loyalty and connection with their customers or clients. They'll inevitably start talking about wanting to be the best place in the industry for people to come and work. In fact, I often find that a really interesting question, just as an aside, to ask people, why would the best people in the industry want to work for your business? And I've got to tell you that the answer is never just money alone. There's always got to be something else. So they start asking themselves, well, if I really wanted to be one of the best places, to have the best people in my industry come work here, what would I have to do? What kind of work conditions would I have to create? And as you get into those discussions, it's very easy to then start bringing in elements of conscious capitalism and saying, well, what is the purpose that's going to bring meaning and motivate people? What is the culture that you're actually trying to create? What does that mean in terms of the kind of leaders that you're trying to develop? And what does that mean in terms of how you integrate your strategy with your stakeholders to create an optimal set of conditions for everybody to thrive? Those sort of conscious capitalism questions come up naturally when you're starting to engage more deeply on what it means to create a great business over time. So that's been my experience at one level, that when you don't always have to lead with this is all about conscious capitalism. You can actually start to talk about what does it mean for you to create a great business. So I think that's the first part of the question you asked, right?
Yeah. Okay. We just answered. No, I think
when to call.
Yeah, when to call. But I'm not sure that the second part is relevant, because my question was, okay, what's your statistic regarding what's trigger clients to call you, or what trigger companies to enter that? But I think that it's already defined in your answer, no? Or you want to elaborate?
Oh, I could elaborate a little bit. I think that often in the life cycle of a company, there are moments when leaders or founders or entrepreneurs step back and ask, or they need to step back and ask, where are we trying to go? And I think that's particularly pertinent for for example, private companies, when there's a generational shift, when the parent starts to say, okay, my children, you're taking over the business, and the children want to come in and now want to start to put their print on the business. They want to create something that takes it beyond where their parents had brought it. That's a moment when people start to ask, okay, what do we want this business to be over time? And I also think that there's a certain point in an entrepreneur's career, and it goes beyond just the initial startup. So once you've proven your business model, once you're starting to get to the point of asking yourself, how do we scale? How do we move to that next level? How do we move from being 10 or 20 million dollars or euros in sales to that 100 million, 200 million level? A question becomes, and what kind of business do we want to be as we do that? And that's another good point to be asking, what kind of culture are we going to need? What kind of people are we going to be wanting to have? And what do we want this organization to really look like at 100 million? Those are also, again, good points in that scaling process to stop and ask some of these questions, because that's a good time to start baking some of this into your business model.
Timothy, your explanation is fascinating. I think that we just got the first glimpse of this huge world of conscious capitalism. And I want to thank you for sharing with us your insight and your thoughts and your experience. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Well,
thank you very much, Timothy. It was lovely, really, really great.
It was my pleasure to be with you folks, and I'm so glad that you're interested in the topic, and thank you so much for having me on.
I would like to thank you personally, because as ambassador of Conscious Capitalism in Israel, I see as a major goal for my business activity is to bring this message to the Israeli industry and try to change the culture, that the way that we act here in Israel, to be more friendly, more consciousness, and more ethic.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Good luck with that, and let me know how I can be helpful.
Thank you very much.
Great. So just let me also thanks our listeners, and again to Mr. Timothy Henry regarding the explanation of the world of conscious capitalism. And all our listeners, we will be happy if you have any thoughts, any ideas to share with us regarding other topics that you want us to speak with. And again, thank you very much, Amir Kahani, my partner in Auren Israel. Wishing you a good day.